Is there anything we can find in the Bible that can point to it as being divinely written? Anything at all? After all, the Bible does promise a reward for an eternal, blissful heaven, or a threat of a torturous, fiery hell. We should, at the least, check to see if such promises can be validated. How can we know if these theologies derive from a real and all-powerful God? Well, the only way to know for sure is if there is any information in there that only a God could have known. Certainly, an all-powerful God would consider that if he is going to speak to the entire span of humanity through a book, he should provide something indisputable as validation. Well, I have searched for years now, and there is nothing. I challenge you to find something. You won't. In fact, if there was something, it would be common knowledge, and the very first thing Christians would use to convince others. Instead, believers have to undergo a process of painfully navigating us through a connect-the-dots kind of picture. They will typically begin with a myriad of vague or confusing Old Testament scriptures that look as though they have foreseen and lead up to Jesus. In my video 9, I effortlessly debunk these attempts and show how all of the Bible's major prophecies have clearly failed, but contort as reinterpretations generation upon generation, and or remain unfulfilled, and we are all waiting for them to eventually come true. Oddly enough, your average believer most likely doesn't even know how to find or draw out these prophetic connections, and therefore will begin talking about devils, angels, and ancient blood sacrifice rituals, or share magical stories such as Moses splitting the Red Sea, or Samson, a Superman with miraculous strength in the locks of his hair. In fact, these stories may end up feeling so incredulous that many will begin to back off from them or sprinkle on some apologetics, such as Eve being duped to curse all humanity by a talking snake. Well, they will say, that was just metaphorical and not to be taken literally. Not only does the Bible lack any comprehensible validation for divinity, but more often than not works against it. The Bible is filled from beginning to end with magical tales that do not mirror reality. Because it lacks any kind of obvious or unmistakable mark of being inspired by or written by an all-knowing and super-intelligent God, believers are likely to revert to and stress faith as being the most important and central tenet for believing. Otherwise, who in their right mind would believe ancient men were flying up into the clouds? As the Bible repeatedly suggests, heaven is up there somewhere? Or that Jesus, upon being crucified, had to first pass underground, where that pesky devil resides, before he miraculously floated up into the clouds. You see, today, it's much more difficult to believe a golden city resides up there, and that it will someday float down and rest on Jerusalem, or that the devil lives underground with fire and brimstone. Faith is essential to Christianity, due to the very fact that even a sliver of validation for any of these stories is non-existent. In fact, it is nearly a requirement that you be indoctrinated into this religion at a very young and impressionable age in order to believe in any of these magical tales and unrealistic theologies. Most reasonable adults, being confronted with these books, will be extremely hard-pressed to believe them. Therefore, Christianity is spread primarily by an inheritance and geography. You are most likely to be a faithful Christian based on what your parents believe and or where you were born, rather than any kind of tangible validation. If you actually open up the Bible and begin to read it with an unbiased mind, it becomes overwhelmingly obvious how it is not the work of an all-powerful and all-knowing God, but rather an accumulation of writings passed on from one generation to the next by passionate religious Jewish men, and some Greek, who knew nothing outside the narrow scope of Bronze Age understanding. For an example of this, let's open up the pages of Leviticus. The entire chapter of 14 deals with leprosy, and in great detail. Leprosy was a horrifying and common plague during a time in which a Jewish God was particularly involved. You see, God was highly concerned with the welfare of his chosen people and how they were to overcome or avoid this frightening disease. Here in Leviticus, God provides a direct remedy for how to be cleansed from leprosy. Then shall the priest command to take for him that is to be cleansed 2 birds alive and clean, and cedar wood, and scarlet, and hyssop. And the priest shall command that one of the birds be killed in an earthen vessel over running water. As for the living bird, he shall take it, and the cedar wood, and the scarlet, and the hyssop, and shall dip them and the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water. And he shall sprinkle upon him that is to be cleansed from the leprosy 7 times, and shall pronounce him clean. Folks, this is voodoo. This magical potion is certainly bogus, if not dangerous. God goes into even further detail on how to deal with a home that is contaminated with leprosy. And he shall look on the plague, and behold, if the plague be in the walls of the house with hollow streaks, greenish or reddish, then he that owneth the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, There seemeth to me to be as it were a plague in the house. Very strange. Doesn't God know anything about leprosy? Leprosy cannot live on walls. In fact, it can only live within another living host. Furthermore, leprosy is very hard to contract. It is transmitted by nasal droplets and is very contagious only when somebody sneezes. It seems very odd that God would fail to mention anything at all about covering your face when you sneeze, or wiping off surfaces with alcohol. It's almost as if God knows nothing about bacteria, or that it is even carried in mucus and not the stains on your walls. With all of God's effort to help relieve his people of leprosy, it appears as though he doesn't understand what is really happening. Instead of teaching the Jews a bogus witch brew that clearly does not work, as leprosy maintained a strong presence within Jewish communities, why didn't God provide the recipe for a potion that actually does work, such as how to grow a simple mold that produces penicillin, which would have easily dealt with a host of bacteria and a great number of other infections? In fact, this would be the kind of indisputable revelation and knowledge I am looking for to prove the Bible is of divine origin, or anything that only a God could have known at that time. In the New Testament, we learn that after Jesus resurrected, and before he floated up into the clouds, he spent 40 days wandering around within Roman provinces. God was here with us. Oddly enough, there is no trace of any contemporary historical records for these miracle 40 days. Nobody in Rome noticed? This wasn't headline news around the world? A magical man was crucified, and now he's out in public teaching and performing miracles? More importantly, what kind of knowledge was Jesus spreading during this magical post-resurrection time? Well, I guess nothing. How marvelous would it have been for all of us if it were Jesus who told us that the sun is a star in which the earth rotates around. Imagine that! Any information such as this would have been very useful to acknowledge that He, and He alone, is God. What an incredible missed opportunity! But, as we should expect, if these stories are nothing but fables, there would be no such validation ever provided. No sign of a superior knowledge anywhere within these holy books. Jesus, or should I say God, appears to have no knowledge above any other man at that time in history. How strange is that? Perhaps he was just too busy performing magic tricks or exorcisms by casting demons out of the blind and transferring them into a herd of pigs. I find it rather odd how he could turn water into wine, but apparently didn't know that Mars, the Roman god of war, was not a star, but rather just a local planet that orbited our sun. If Jesus was truly concerned for those who were ill, as he certainly appears to be in the Bible, why didn't he explain how tiny organisms we now refer to as germs will make us sick, and that by simply boiling water we can avoid many of the illnesses and diseases that are afflicting us? What an incredible missed opportunity God had with His unlimited access to knowledge to reveal His true glory and to help us, but instead lets us suffer for thousands of years before scientists finally figured it out during the age of secularism. Why would He let secularism have all the glory? In fact, the only revelational information ever provided to us by Jesus or the Bible is a belief that an ancient blood sacrifice ritual will forgive you from sin. Well, that is, only if you believe in Jesus and send Him money. Yet, I must point out how this isn't really a grand revelation at all. Nearly every religion, from as far back as we can divulge, practiced and believed in some form of this blood sacrifice ritual. In fact, nearly every theology and practice in the Old and New Testament is nothing more than a hand-me-down or an evolution from previous religions, spanning from ancient Egyptians and Greeks to Judaism. They all borrow from each other. From the Israelites wandering 40 days in the desert to Jesus wandering for 40 days in Rome, or the 12 tribes of Israel coinciding with the 12 apostles. Coincidence? No. It's not prophecy, folks. It's called religious evolution. Jesus has never introduced anything new or even helpful to humanity outside of asking us to feed the poor and love your neighbor, which also has been a basic tenet within most every other religion and culture throughout human history. You would think a New Testament, inspired or written by an all-knowing God, might offer some kind of new revelation, or that there would be some sign of divine knowledge. But no, nothing at all. To the contrary, in the book of John, God teaches us about a magical pool that gets stirred up by an angel, and whoever gets in first is healed. They call this the Pool of Bethsaida. My friends, this is clearly a fable. Magical healing pools are not real. It is overwhelmingly clear that if a Christian God wrote, inspired, or authorized the Bible as his word, he appears to have no greater knowledge than the average man of that day. And rather than introducing any kind of practical or helpful knowledge, God instead routinely endorses common and popular mythological ideas and stories of that time as if they are true. It may be of no surprise, but many characters in the Bible are told to have directly talked with God. Now, these kind of interactions should have produced something remarkable. But no, nothing. This very much reminds me of psychics today who claim they can communicate with other worlds or talk to spirits. What kind of knowledge do we ever gain through these interactions? How many of us even believe such things are true? In the Bible, we read a story about Solomon visiting a psychic to conjure up a dead prophet, in which he succeeds. The Bible does not refer to such activities as bogus, but rather lends support to what most rational minds would refer to as quackery. In the book of Matthew, we read about Moses and Elias, who had long been deceased, appearing as ghosts and consulting with Jesus, in which, oddly enough, nothing more is ever noted about the event. The author of Matthew leaves us with no idea why this mystical meeting occurred, or what these ghostly prophets might have had to say. This story seems to have no purpose other than an early Christian scribe's attempt to make Jesus appear more important and luring to the Jews by having him rub shoulders with the great Jewish prophets. Regardless, even if such psychic activities were to be true, and all of this communication is happening with God and spirits and ghostly prophets, why do we never pick up on anything revolutionary about our lives or this world? Put this in comparison to someone like Thomas Edison, who actually brought something into this world that helps us. He attained knowledge about electricity and built a light bulb. What have psychics, the Bible, or even Jesus offered in comparison to this? Great-grandpa is in heaven and wants you to know he is doing fine? That gays don't belong in our societies? A promise for an eternal heaven if you believe in Jesus? Christians will often say, "Oh, but Jesus has also been such a great force for good in our world." Well, maybe. He certainly has inspired an occasional soup kitchen to open up, or had his name dedicated to a highly profitable hospital. On the other hand, we know that Christianity has also been the cause for much division between friends, families, and even nations. And any kind of positive transformation Jesus brings into a human life is no more profound than that of most any other religion anywhere on earth. Whereas true knowledge and realistic revelation can help in profound ways. Louis Pasteur in 1860 was a chemist who developed antidotes and cures to many dangerous illnesses such as anthrax and rabies. He also successfully invented a way to pasteurize milk and make it safe from tuberculosis. This is precisely the kind of knowledge that can make a true and helpful change to our lives. But, ironically, God has never received any credit for such real and tangible revolutions in our world at any time in human history. And his attempts to try fail. When Einstein revealed his laws of relativity, it was one of the most incredible uses of intelligence ever known to mankind. Yet, here in the Bible, supposedly written or inspired by an all-knowing God, profoundly fails to enlighten us with any kind of achievement or knowledge about our world or life. There is no comparison. The only kind of awe the Bible has ever produced is a talking donkey or a prophet turning a stick into a snake in a battle of wizardry. Strange, isn't it, that the creator of the universe, a being far more intelligent than man, wrote or inspired a book that is completely void of any advancements for humanity or knowledge above or beyond that of magic and barbaric Bronze Age thinking? That's the reality of the Bible, my friends. The Bible falls embarrassingly short compared to such wonderful accomplishments of somebody like Isaac Newton. Newton went into isolation in 1665 to escape the plague. After about a year of working, he had discovered the law of gravitation and motion, the field of optics, and invented calculus. Such discoveries pushed through the Dark Ages and ushered in the age of secularism, whereas true knowledge was finally free to work and help improve our lives. God deservingly received no credit. In fact, James Fergus, being quoted from a speech in 1883, said, "The Christian religion brought about a long period of ignorance, still known as the Dark Ages, during which thought was curbed and common education banished." You see, the Bible has long presented serious problems for the church concerning scientific advancements. This is precisely because the Bible fails to introduce any knowledge outside of Bronze Age understanding of life and the universe. In fact, it overwhelmingly lends support to ideas and theologies that are clearly wrong and/or do not mirror reality in any way. If there is a God out there somewhere, I would argue that it has no affiliation with any so-called holy books being published on earth. It would have to be a being much greater than that. Stay tuned to Stairway to Reason for Part 2, whereas I will go into great detail on what the Bible actually teaches us about cosmology. It is a true eye-opener that you won't want to miss. Stay strong and wise, my friends.
I don't believe in masquerades. I don't believe that you're okay. I don't believe that God will save